First, let's get started here with Joe and Robert. The very first thing we're going to do is ask each of them to tell you something about themselves. A lot of you guys know them, but you know, sometimes you don't know somebody as well as you think you know them. I mean, I've known Joe for many years, but I didn't know he had 5 young boys. So we will hear something about each of them. I want them to tell you about themselves. I want them to tell you what they do. And then I want them to tell you what it is about this issue that is so important to them. That's how we're going to start. And I think I'll ask Joe to start first. And you know, you have your own mic right back there. And when we're not talking, the rest of us need to be still with our mics so as not to create excess noise.
Okay, as Mary Lou said, my name is Joe Frank, and I live just outside of Sterling in northeast Colorado with my wife and 5 young boys. It's pretty eventful in our house. I'm the manager of the Lower South Platte Water Conservancy District. The district encompasses over 400,000 acres within parts of Morgan, Washington, Logan, and Sedgwick counties. There's over 30 ditch and reservoir companies that irrigate within the district. There's over 1,000 wells in the district. So we have both surface and groundwater users in the district. I'm a 3rd-generation native Coloradoan. I grew up really close, within 20 miles of where my great-grandfather homesteaded and farmed on an irrigated farm for several years with his 16 children. So we're not even close to that. But I actually grew up on a dryland farm just outside of the irrigated valley, and so we drove pretty much every day to work. I worked on a pig farm with my dad. Went to school and drove across the irrigated valley, and to me it was just fascinating the landscaping differences between what irrigation brought to an area and what just outside of that with the natural prairie and dry land looked like, and not only the landscape but the economic differences there was between irrigation and dry land and native grasses. So I really have been fascinated with that all my life, and it's really, I guess, important to a rural area, an area that's removed from the Front Range. It doesn't have, much other economic driving forces beside irrigated agriculture in an area like Fort Morgan, Sterling, or Julesburg. So this is very important to me. This issue. When I went off to college, I became a civil engineer. I always wanted to be a farmer, but I figured I'd just come back and work with farmers and help them out. But I figured I couldn't cut it as a farmer. So, but anyways, and when I came back to the district in 2003, I worked up in Denver for 5.5 years after college. Came back to the district, took a job in 2003, and really, as the slide shows the history, there was a lot of turmoil in that time. The people down in the area, the surface water users had not received their fair amount of water. I look back at this year compared to 2012, very similar hydraulic patterns. Yet some of the ditches received 4 times the amount of water that they received in 2002. So there was a huge amount of turmoil in the area, a lot of scrambling, a lot of people that were well users and surface users scrambling to figure out ways to work this out, to provide augmentation and to work conjunctively together. And I think really in the district, a lot of cooperation, a lot of collaboration, a lot of people came together during a time of crisis. And so this has just been really what I've dealt with a lot. I do a lot of accounting for wells in the district. I work with surface and well users, and to me, it's very important that we work together and that we like as mentioned before, we maximize beneficial use, but we protect the water rights and the water users. And to me, when you really look at the way the river works, the history is so important. The aquifer developed from surface irrigation. It filled in. The river drains the aquifer. Those return flows are relied upon from people, since the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so it's so crucial that we work together and that we make sure that we do not impact other users, because it's definitely an economic impact to those farmers as well. So to me, I really want to look not just at the district, but regionally, the basin as a whole, and solve this problem, because it affects people's livelihood, that's for sure.
Okay, let's hear from you, Robert.
All right. Am I up? Good, thanks. First of all, I guess, Mary Lou, I noticed that we don't have any water up here. And so, being a good farmer, I brought my own, and I'll offer you all some water. So, as my first token of cooperation there. So there you go, sure. But water is so important to all of us. And I really appreciated this opportunity to work on this panel. I don't know whether many of you know this, but when I graduated high school, the last thing I wanted to be was a farmer. Watching the struggles that my parents went through, really starting off from nothing when my dad was actually, after he was released from a relocation camp in Utah, he came to Colorado because Governor Carr at that time was very open to allowing Japanese Americans to come to the state. He and his family moved to Colorado, and so luckily I had his blessing to go off and try something else. But I've been back on the farm now for 20 years, and I really appreciated that time. It's a family operation. For those of you who don't know, I live in Brighton, Colorado, and it's my mom and my dad, and we have a invaluable staff, irreplaceable staff. That we farm about 2,500 acres. We have 14 alluvial groundwater wells that we use that are currently augmented through Central. We also have surface water rights that are we have four ditch systems. We've got the Bratner, the Brighton, the Fulton, the Platteville, and the Henry Lynn. I'm actually on the board for 2 of those ditch systems. And I think last year, as we looked over those records, those 5 ditch systems diverted just under 74,000 acre feet of water from the river to irrigate our area. And so again, it kind of goes back to what the history and what Joe was talking about, that development of our irrigation, our irrigated agriculture there is really supplying a lot of water for the alluvial groundwater. How the restrictions on the well has really affected us firsthand. I think because we have surface water and well water rights, we haven't been as adversely impacted as others, but we had one farm that was 2 wells that were under the GASPs, and so we tried on our own to develop an augmentation plan, and we worked on that for 2.5 years, I think, and just found we were fortunate. We felt we were fortunate. We had a good relationship with a municipality that was willing to lease us some water, and so we moved forward with that. But just the huge costs involved with engineering and legal fees, and then the ongoing costs that looked like it was going to take to get through water court and then even beyond. We just felt like it wasn't economically viable for us as a vegetable farmer to do that. Our returns are usually between 0.5% to 1%, and so that additional cost we just couldn't justify. So we ended up unhooking the wells and moving that center pivot system to another farm, and now that's a dryland farm for us. We're growing dryland wheat. And also we've changed our cropping plan. We used to be totally vegetables, fresh market sweet corn, fresh market cabbage, and broccoli. Now we don't grow any more broccoli, sorry to say. We've started to grow now dryland wheat, pinto beans, some feed barley, and field corn. I think, I don't know anything about livestock. I'm always learning new things about livestock. I think a lot of people don't realize in the general public what a difference there is between irrigated agriculture as well. When you look at vegetable production, there's 2 big things why your source of water is so important. And number 1 is marketability. We don't measure our yields according to weight or pounds per acre or tons per acre. We measure it by marketable unit per acre. So many times you look, I make the example that a cow doesn't really know the difference between a mature 5-inch ear of corn and an 8-inch ear of corn. But that consumer at the grocery store sure does. I mean, they're not going to buy a 4-inch ear of corn. And so we miss a critical irrigation with vegetables where suddenly we get a dry tip or dry husk, or the cabbage has burnt leaves on the outside. Suddenly our yield has gone from good to nothing, absolutely nothing. And so we really depend on a dependable water supply. And the second one, which is really making the news a lot now, is food safety. We hear so much about E. coli, salmonella, listeria. FDA has just come out with their proposed rules. I think it's 1,227 pages. Leave it to our government. But a lot of it has to do with the quality of water that you use. So we, in the past, just recently, and as a requirement in our third-party audits, we have to monitor our waters, and we see that surface water supplies, the fluctuation in what we measure as generic E. coli, the fluctuation level in generic E. coli, which is an indicator. It's not necessarily saying that it's unhealthy. It's just an indicator of what total pathogens can be in that water. Fluctuates tremendously with surface water. I mean, you can all imagine that, stormwater runoff, running off of golf courses where there's flocks of geese landing, or people walking their pets and not picking up their pet waste. There's a lot of opportunity for surface water to pick up contamination, which is really critical for vegetable production that we monitor. Groundwater wells, of course, are more isolated, protected, and then if for any reason you do need to treat them, it's a lot easier to treat groundwater wells. You have consistent flows, they're contained, and once you've treated them, they're usually pretty good. And so those two things, marketability and food safety, are really important issues for vegetable production. I think, Reagan, you went over some of the goals that you're looking at, and those are goals that I hope. I mean, the groundwater resource is so important for us that I hope that the study will find ways that we can better utilize that resource. It's just so important for us. I mean, I think over the last 10 years, we've cut back. We've reduced our staff by about 20%. We've reduced our acreage by about 30%, all because of the restriction on the wells. And like I said, we don't grow near the number of vegetables that we used to in the past. So I hope that the study can bring forth some scientific evidence that can support better utilization of the resource.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you, Robert and Joe. Thanks a lot. Let's start to unpack some of the issues, okay, and see where the differences might lie. I guess to start with, what I'd like you both to do is take a moment and help the audience understand from your part of the basin what's going on with the high groundwater issue. How do you see it? What's causing it, et cetera? So, Joe, maybe you could talk about the lower basin.
Well, I actually live in a subdivision that has experienced some high groundwater in the past. So, that Sterling area that had the little circle on it was, there's a couple subdivisions really that are a part of your pilot project. But, even in looking at the two subdivisions from some of the preliminary data that I've seen, it just is amazing the difference in the dynamics. They're not even 2 miles apart. The geology is different. In one subdivision, the bedrock really starts to rise up. You look at the hydrology in the area. So I think there's just a whole different dynamic there. But yeah, you've seen some rising groundwater. But over the past few months here, with the drier conditions, we've seen the water table drop down as well. So, but historically in the Sterling area, we've seen a high groundwater table. In the 1920s, there were drainage ditches that were dug right around the town to lower the groundwater table on productive farm ground. It was water that was moved, out of the area. So I think historically we've seen high groundwater. I was talking to some sugar beet farmers who just had a meeting a month or so ago, and they were talking about a slideshow that they saw, and the Great Western Sugar Factory in the early 1900s had to do some dewatering to build their facilities. So I think you saw what Parshell talked about. We had rising groundwater tables and a strengthening river. So I think these are things that have historically happened. I think, yes, wells artificially over that time frame did lower water, and the I guess maybe the under-augmentation, during that time frame, kept the water table down. So I think there's a lot of different dynamics. Like you pointed out before, it's hard to just pinpoint it on one specific issue. I mean, we had tremendous 150% of average precipitation in 2011. So in the Sterling area, I mean that's definitely a large factor. So I think, yeah, it's an issue. We need to look at solving the problem, but they solved it in the past. They solved it, historically, in dewatered areas because of irrigation.
What's your perspective on your area?
I think there's real concerns that there is over-augmentation going on. I mean, that's what I sense a lot of people wondering is why they're having to make up for post-pumping depletions. Has that been made up? I mean, how full is the aquifer at, and is it overflowing? I mean, there's some concerns that all this effort that's gone through and the augmentations plans that were passed, they went through such scrutiny that some of the stipulations really just to make sure, and the insurer, and I'm a surface water right owner as well, just to ensure that they weren't being injured. Is there a possibility that there's been over-augmentation going on now, and is that leading to the high groundwater table?
So some have said that the river worked fine in the 80s and 90s in a period of partial augmentation. I think that's what Robert's referring to. And then there are voices also saying we're over-augmenting now. So what's your perspective on that? Did it work fine in the 80s and 90s? And do you see a change now that's better or worse?
Well, in my opinion, I think you saw on the slideshow as well, I think we had a masked, thinking that maybe it was working fine because of we did have some wetter years, wetter time frames. It was way above average, I mean, over that time frame. And I think there was definitely times that people complained about, surface water being impacted by wells, but I think the perfect storm did occur in 2001, 2002, but I would definitely say that I think that the same thing was occurring in the 80s and 90s. We just didn't see it because we didn't have the real drought conditions. And I guess that's the hard thing is if a well caused an immediate impact on the river, we wouldn't be talking about this issue. It's the fact that it causes it's a delayed time impact on the river. And so, we don't have that crystal ball. We don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. And we looked at 2011. It was a pretty banner year. Conditions changed on a dime in 2012, and we were all. I mean, there was a lot of shortages. It was felt basin wide. Surface water diverters, even though return flow conditions were better in 2012 than they were in 2002, it still wasn't enough water. We have a shortage. We live in a semi-arid, very arid, especially in specific years, as far as snowpack and precipitation goes. So it's tough to say we're over-augmenting because I really don't believe a water table tells you whether or not you're over-augmenting or not, because I think we saw from previous studies that really impacts the flow of the river as well.
You want to comment on how the river worked then versus now and how it's working in your part?
Well, we're depending a lot more on surface water supplies since wells were always supplemental in the sense it always cost us more money to use a well because of the pumping costs. And so, our first choice was always use surface water when we could, and then we'd rely on wells to make up any differences from that. I don't know whether this is a good analogy or not, but I wish we could find a way to better utilize the resources, just like on our Fulton ditch. One of our farms is at the tail end of the ditch, and so we're almost the last person to draw water. And it's frustrating for us because, of course, the ditch riders are great. Don't get me wrong, I'm not complaining about them. But to maintain that level, and I'm not complaining against other farmers that may be in the audience that are upstream of my head gate, but it's really tough because, if they open up a bunch of head gates and the ditch is pretty small, all of a sudden our level drops off. And it's tough because the ditch rider then is complaining if anything is spilling over the top, because the state engineer's office will call him and say, hey, you're diverting too much water. You shouldn't be returning water downstream because, again, it's so much farther down from your point of diversion that it could be affecting senior water rights holders in between that point when it returns to the river. So they're under strict controls to make sure that none returns. But if each shareholder on that ditch was requiring that they have absolutely the same amount, we would actually probably be spilling a lot more. And that's almost the analogy that I see in the state right now, is the sense to make sure that we're not injuring every single person along the way, we have to have an oversupply along the whole system. And that's what I'm kind of wondering about. If we couldn't develop a system that we could kind of work together all the way along there and not allow so much to spill at the end, I guess. Does that make sense? Am I making any sense? More water.
You want to respond? Go ahead.
Yeah, I would actually like to respond to that, because I think that, you might be getting to the point that the fact that we do recharge and we end up with some excesses at certain times, and especially, at the beginning of the year, and it's just the nature of recharge. You put water in the ground, and you're subject to it coming back to the river and hoping it's going to be there in a time when you need it. No different, than when a well pumps, it's going to affect the river at some point in time. So, I've looked at ditch systems who have regulating reservoirs along their ditches where they've put water in, and they've stored it for a while and released it over time, so you don't spill that water out the end, and you really maximize the efficiency of that ditch. I think we could really do the same thing along the South Platte, where if you actually had control of water, you stored it in a bucket and opened that valve when you needed it, and didn't release it to the river when you didn't need it. I think we could go a long ways in solving that. I think you could really make that same analysis with a smaller system across the big system.
I think you have a good point, Joe, but I think that's where it takes real communication with the upstream and the downstream end, because right now the buckets are seeming like they're at the downstream end, where upstream people sometimes can't take advantage of those. So we need to figure out some cooperative agreements between those users. I mean, because it's just, right now it seems like, we have to totally prove that we're not going to have any injury and make sure we have adequate supplies hitting the river, and yet, is there ever a time that a well can pump within its priority date? I mean, right now we're not assuming that at all. I mean, all wells are assumed when you develop your augmentation plan that you're going to be pumping out a priority, and so it makes it tough. Yeah, it makes it tough.
So let's talk a little bit about well curtailment that's been implicated as part of the issue here as to high groundwater levels. And I guess I'd like to hear from both of you what you've seen in terms of impacts in your parts of the river. We've heard very different stories about the extent of the economic impacts, the acreage impacts. We've also heard that the additional water for surface water users has covered that over. And if you look at the basin as a whole, productivity is great. So we've just shifted the resource around a bit. So what are your thoughts about what's happened to curtailment relative to high groundwater and economics in your various sections of the basin?
Well, I look at curtailment really as a water supply issue to start out with, I guess. I look at the fact that, we were just looking at our basin roundtable numbers and needs assessment. The basin as a whole, on average, has a 378,000 acre-foot gap, agriculture gap. That's on average. So in a dry year, you can see 2012, that's even magnified more. So surface water users are curtailed. You just see it based on what the call is. If somebody's called out, then the next upstream surface water user just can't use their water. So they're curtailed, and we have seen, at least from the numbers that I've seen from 2012 and 2002, an improvement in some deliveries, because of, lots of factors, but I would say that one of them would be, a fuller augmentation throughout the basin. But I really think that it really comes down to a water supply issue, and we've had some, there's definitely more wells up further that are curtailed. The further upstream it is, the harder it is to develop a supply for augmentation. We know that. But I do accounting for many different augmentation plans. We've had curtailment, and going into next year, if we continue this drought, we're going to see severe curtailment. But so ultimately, to me, it still comes down to a water supply. We're just water short in this basin. We need to work together to develop that supply and figure this. To me, that's a big part of the solution.
You want to comment?
Yeah, I would agree with Joe. And another factor I think was briefly mentioned was as Trans Mountain water is used to extinction. So we're seeing, I think, potential yields on our surface water shares become less just because of that. More and more municipalities are using all their Trans Mountain water to extinction. So that's also creating that dilemma. It's, the effects of the curtailment, like I said, on our operation and others have been even more severe. I think you were at the groundwater conference that I went to, and we listened to Mr. Harry Strohauer talk about, where he may be looking to move his operation to out of state because of the lack of water. I think he also tried to work on an augmentation plan and failed. And so, I think in our one-page paper that I wrote, change is never easy. And so we're all facing a lot of different changes in our own operations. But it's been a struggle. I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I had to talk to my dad about this. And, when you're forced to talk to your father about something, sometimes it doesn't always go well. But I learned a lot of history about that. And, it had to do with the internment camps, but also about just how the farmers back then really were taking a gamble and spending sometimes money that they didn't have to drill these wells because they were looking for options in the 1950s, I think, as that clip said, of how to deal with this. And so they were taking that risk, and a lot of people, whether it was their bankers or other individuals, were encouraging to view this as an investment. And so when they put that kind of time and investment in this, I think it is a difficult process to change their mindset or to change it and say, we need to look at the system as a whole, and we need to be fair. And that's why I hope some of this study will help us. If there is changes that need to be made, can help us identify those changes.
Good.
I would like to point out to the group that we asked both of these gentlemen ahead of time to try to focus their thoughts into one page that they then could share with one another ahead of time. And that's what Robert is referring to. It provided an opportunity for them to hit the deck running with the dialogue. And then we actually had a session a week ago to try to break the ice about this. So I mentioned that to you because I want you to know about the process, because you may want to use a similar process in trying to work with other issues other times.
But with different people. I told Mary Lou, did a lot of you folks see the rescue out on the lake? I told Mary Lou that I might be safer out there on the ice than I was going to be in here, so I was going to volunteer my services out there.
So, Joe, you've mentioned this issue of the river behaving differently between 2012 and 2002 drought a couple of times. I'm interested in that, as well as groundwater levels. Are there observations that you want to make about why it's operating differently, how so, and what's happening with groundwater in your part of the basin?
Well, I have been tracking, the Kersey gauge, from 2012 through and 2002, the two different years. And granted, there was some different hydrology, but there was a lot of similarities between snowpack and really precipitation overall. And as you saw the little, there was a few rain events that really came down Kersey, but not very many of them. And they were both kind of similar to, in times in 2002 and 12. But, so I think but after you really see those rain events attenuate out, then you really see a base flow that was about 125 cubic feet per second greater, at Kersey in 2012 than it was in 2002. Granted, there's a lot of different dynamics there, but 125 CFS is in a dry time is a lot of water, and like I mentioned, one of the ditches down in our area received 4 times the amount of water. It still wasn't their full supply, but it was 4 times the amount of water they did in 2002. a lot of dynamics going on, but I mean, I have to believe that, to me, it points a lot to the fact that, that full augmentation does really impact the river. I mean, and well pumping does. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that when a well pumps it, I mean, if we add water to the system, about was
Groundwater,
groundwater.
2012 groundwater, what your observations were.
In our area, for the most part, of course, we saw the rising in 2011, but starting around April, May, you really started seeing a diving off of the groundwater table and a dropping. I think, once again, a lot of that is due to precipitation, but there were areas, I think, recently that you saw some water table start to come back up a little bit. That's all preliminary, but I think, there's, there was some irrigation practices above that, some filling of reservoirs. So there's all the dynamics down there, but ultimately, it seems to me overall that the water table was declining in 2012 as it was in 2011. So precipitation definitely is a big part of that, I think.
So you guys have both mentioned augmentation plans and whether or not we're doing this right, but from different points of view. And some say that the whole court process of getting an augmentation plan through more or less makes them very conservative by nature. That's what you've got to do. You've got to promise a bit to get there. Others have pointed out that all of the burden of non-injury is on the junior, on the well pumper and the aug plans, et cetera. Are those observations correct? And do you have a comment about them either way?
Well, as I mentioned, there were some concerns that plans are over-augmenting, and there's some concerns that some of the make-up water for, post-pumping depletions, for example, with some of those wells that move from gas to central, that really through other sources, whether they're through excess water that's run through our surface water systems, or whether it's climate events, that those depletions have been made up already, and yet they're still paying for those. So there's some concern that that's true, that these augmentation plans are really super conservative, and as we talked about, whether the question is whether they're leading to some of the high groundwater issues that people are facing.
Do you have a different opinion?
Well, I definitely, I think the burden is on the wells to make that replacement. Once again, you don't have, the unfortunate thing is we don't have that crystal ball, and it is a timing issue. And so, we have these dynamic, the fact that we have recharge in the ground, we lose control of the timing there. We pump the well, and then at some point it comes back. So that's why we have to kind of make those projections out there to know that we're going to have enough water. But I think if we had some more supplies out there, some different types of supplies, some variety with that, the storage bucket, the idea out there, that you could have that water banked away and then open it up when you only needed it, and that way you're not releasing it when you don't, right. In 2011, there was a lot of water coming back to the river during free river times, and it probably wasn't being utilized. So, but I've always made the point to people, we would not have let that water go if we had it in a reservoir. We would have kept it back and used it for another day. So that's the inherent problem. I mean, it's hard to do it with the tools that we have right now. I mean, the tools work, but they're inefficient.
So let's go there by nature of sort of wrapping up. I'm a guy who studies things for a living. I'll do that forever, but I think there's a lot of people in this room that would like to see some solutions. So what do you guys think? What are some solutions that each of you would think we could put on the table and begin to think about and analyze as we go forward here on 1278?
I think I'd follow up a little bit with what Joe said is we need more buckets it'd be nice to have more buckets all along the river that we could, store some of this water, because, you know, hope we get a better understanding of the alluvium and how it operates, but it's still, it seems like there's so many variables that, you know, when you talk about all these models that are used to develop these delay times and the paths, and that there's so many other variables that can be input into that. And I just, I'm wondering if we could better utilize the resource by having water right at the river rather than utilizing some of these systems.
I think there's a couple of things. I think we have some short-term maybe solutions where Robert mentioned before the collaboration efforts, the dialogue between, you know, people who are needing to have augmentation supplies, working together, sharing infrastructure, you know, when you can utilize that infrastructure, taking advantages of the fact that there are excesses at some point, and shortages in other plans, and working together there. So I think that collaboration is definitely needs to happen, and that dialogue needs to happen. And then secondly, it definitely comes down to the fact that we are so short, and we need to try and maximize within our basin, and strategically put in, you know, buckets, and capture, you know, the last 3 years. We had banner years last year. We could have put more water away to use it for these years. We could have then, you know, probably used it for more exchanges, and I mean, it just, to me, it just opens things up even more. I mean, I don't know that, I mean, it just seems daunting that we have 378,000 acre feet of gap, but, you know, on the other hand, we've pumped I think in 2008, the numbers were 600,000 acre feet of water. 100,000 of that was for municipal use, and 500,000 was for agriculture use. And so we are conjunctively using our water, but I think we can do a better job of that, I think, by making those long-term supplies available.
Do either of you want to offer solutions for the localized high groundwater areas? Do you see anything there that we might be able to do? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think, once again, I think each area is specific. I mean, there's a specific issue going on, you know. I mean, so we have to look at that specific area. I don't think you can do an overarching solution to the entire basin. So, I mean, it may take some dewatering, you know, facilities. It may take some, you know, some management, some type of things going on there. But I think, you know, you have to look at the specific dynamics, the geology. What's the causes there? What's the solution? So, I don't think there's one solution that one size doesn't fit all. Just like a lot of different solutions. So,
Comment? Back to you.
Yeah, that's a tough one, because I know I've talked to some of the landowners, and, you know, all of a sudden to them it seems like it's a burden that they didn't cause. And so to ask them to go through something, I mean, it's just like maybe what you're experiencing, Joe, with the high water table for the homeowners. All of a sudden, you know, if they didn't have it there before, all of a sudden it's there. I'm sure they're wondering why they're going to have to pay for that dewatering when to them it seems like it's a problem caused by somebody else. And so I agree with you, looking at individual sites and seeing what needs to be done. But I don't know, we'll rely on you, Reagan, to figure out all the answers for us.
Well, that's a good segue for us to go to our next section of the program. Thank you guys so much. Do they look like guinea pigs?
Mary Lou, if I could, I forgot to mention, John, I'd really like to thank you and the governor for working on this bill with us. I know the governor at one time was really considering vetoing it, and I know you went through a lot of conversations with a lot of people, and so I hope that we can indeed work together to find solutions. So thank you very much for your final support of this process.
Good.
I've given each of these two one more task, and that is they're going to help us with the microphones here. In order to give you an example of what we have in mind with these reading of responses from your pages that you have there. I've asked two fellows to be our examples. So we're going to hear from Jean Manuelo first, and then we're going to hear from Glenn Fritzler. So they're each going to come up and be at each of these, one of you, Jean here and Glenn over here. And then, because each of them will just take about 1 minute, you may want to line up along the edges so that you can be ready to come read your 1 minute response. So Jean, why don't you come up here? Glenn, why don't you come up here? And any of you who want, go ahead and start lining up, because just after they're finished, you will have your turn. Okay, Jean, let's hear one of your responses.
Okay, line up a little ways away from me, so don't want anybody to hit me here. First of all, I'm Gene Manuelo. I am the ag rep for the South Platte Roundtable. So the reason I say that is I am very interested in ag. In fact, that's why I got on to the roundtable to begin with, is because I felt it was important for the future of our water, for ag to be involved of what was happening. So Mary Lou said I had to read this and make it brief. So my comment is that I'm concerned that we are pitting ag against ag. My hope is that we are able to pump as many wells as possible, because I am interested in ag and all wells pumping, without causing damage to other senior water users.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. Glenn Fritzler, Weld County farmer. I'm concerned that the aquifer is being misused. Record high groundwater has caused my basement to flood the last 3 years. Over augmentation and pumping curtailments are primary reasons for this. If nothing is done, other homes on our farm and leach fields will start to fail. The 2013 drought and not being able to use the excessive full aquifer. We need to preserve the right to pump wells when surface water is short, and especially in time of drought. Our water quality, by allowing groundwater to get high, leach fields can now allow raw sewage to enter the aquifer. I'm concerned my grandson will not be able to run through the sprinkler like I did. I'd like to have more information why we are still paying for past depletions even though we have record high groundwater. Why are we required to augment 100% given that the high groundwater is at record levels?
Thank you. And now we need someone over here to read yours. Yes, sir.
I'm not that creative, so I'll read something that someone else wrote that is. This is an overview put together by Justice Hobbs a few years ago, and it's the overview of the Colorado groundwater law. In it, he states back in 1914, the Supreme Court ruled that the tributary aquifer of a natural stream is part of that stream. And that's the first major ruling that tied the surface flow to the streams. In 1951, it said all groundwater is tributary water unless proven different. A couple other rulings, again, the Supreme Court consistently ruling in the favor of the priority system. Most recent was the early 2000s that initiated a lot of the well shutdowns, restrictions of the state engineer, and increasing true augmentation. Thank you.
Okay, some folks are reading what they have written. Please come forward. Yes, sir. Yeah.
My name is Don Jones. I live in Fort Morgan, Colorado. Given the expense of building reservoirs out of stream storage and so forth, and the complexity of trying to get the permitting to do that, and also given the fact that the South Platte River Aquifer is an underground storage vessel already, where no augmentation is needed and where the groundwater quality is already pretty well taken care of, doesn't it make sense to use retiming wells to meet stream flow shortages up and down the river and various reaches of the river?
Thank
I'm Dave Petrocco. I'm a vegetable grower in Brighton, Fort Lupton, Platteville, and the Greeley area. We utilize a number of irrigation wells and surface rights. We utilize about 15 GMS wells from Central. We have about 10 WAS wells, which were formerly the Fort Morgan deal, and a couple of coffin wells. They're supplemental water to our senior rights. They work very well. And I came today, and I'm glad that this presentation has been made, because we need to get our thoughts out and try to find a solution to something here that I think would be very economical, beneficially to the state of Colorado. The impact of not utilizing the wells like we at one time did, and currently we could, I think, utilize a little more because of the level of the water. We need the state of Colorado to issue on a pro rata basis junior water that is above normal water levels to irrigation wells in an AUG plan on the South Platte River Basin. When the water subsides to average levels, then the pumping can be adjusted. And I'd sure like to see the state of Colorado come in and help us with that project.
Love hearing ideas for solutions. Okay, let's hear from someone on this side of the room.
Larry Cirillo, I don't know if I have a specific thing, more of a question than anything. Reagan mentioned that one of the third items that they were tasked with is to find a better way for the state engineer to administer all of this. And I thought that perhaps Bob made a point when he was talking about the groups getting together, and one of my thoughts is there a way for the groups locally that are dealing with these water issues to have a little more control over how that water is managed, maybe in conjunction with the state engineer, but perhaps, again, we've got these hard and fast rules and statutes about how the water is administered and so on. Do we need to take a look at those? And this gets into what Reagan was talking about, that there are these institutional and political issues that we're going to have to deal with. But that's one of them that concerns me. The other thought I've had for a lot of years, I'm also a hydrogeologist from CSU. We've built over these years all these malls, and we've got all this impermeable area. To me, that says that the water is running off a lot faster and getting to the stream quicker than when it was natural ground and it had to infiltrate and then get to the stream. Now, I don't know to what extent that's being studied or to what extent that has an effect, but I'm wondering, is that being looked at?
By the way, we're recording all of these questions, and part of the website will be a place where you can go and see what other people have written as their concerns, fears, hopes, ideas, but there also will be a place to put questions, and we will periodically go through that and work with those in the state and other places to try to come up with answers for questions that you pose.
Bob Winter, retired farmer. Joe, I really appreciated your comments about working as a whole basin. I think as a part of a solution to have a basin-wide, not the lower, not the middle. To my understanding, the upper South Platte is is on the other side of Chatfield. Is that correct? That's what they tell me. That's what they tell me. I'm sorry, I could be wrong about that. But I think one of the solutions is that we sit down together and figure out an answer to some of these questions, and it needs to be done on a basin-wide basis economically. And I think your geology comments are right on. It's way different in different areas, and some things are a lot more tributary. They come to the river quicker, the depletions are quicker, they're later. I think those are all good comments, and I appreciate that. And I want to thank both of you for doing a really great job, Rob and Joe, for your presentation.
My name's Dave Dakett, and I farm out by Hudson, Colorado. And these post-pumping depletions is a real big problem. And getting augmentation plans or getting your pump to run. And you engineers are real good at making graphs and charts so we could visualize things. Could you make a visualization of the post-pumping depletions, where they are, how much they are, so forth? I'd like to see it.
Hi. I'm Frank Eckhart on 2 different ditches in below Mr. Sakata's. One ditch is at the end. I think one of the things that, Reagan, you need to look at is the pre-adiphytes on the ditch, on the river, compared to what it was like in the 1920s to the 40s and to the present time. I think with aerial photos, you're going to find quite a few more trees, especially after 1965 flood. One of our ditches, the western ditch, is on the end of the river, South Platte, before the St. Vrain comes in. This year, we had no water going past us, so Joe was only getting the Poudre River and the St. Vrain water down there. We've got 2 rights, 1865 and 1871, a total of 96 CFS. After about the June 20th, the most we got out of the river was about 14 CFS. So I think we're getting hurt above the St. Vrain, clear back to Denver, with paper changes, moving water around. So that's why the wells were drilled under our 2 ditches anyway. Thank you.
I'm Trevor Fritzler. I'm a son of a 3rd-generation farmer, which is a fancy word for a farmhand. So my concern is as municipalities become more and more efficient and they have less return back to the river, our wells become more and more needed, because the less river water we're going to have is less surface water we're going to have, which is the more groundwater that we're going to need to use. And I don't know about you guys, if you guys have any sons that want to take over, but one day in my life I plan to take over my dad's farm, and when he hands me the keys and says, "Here you go," I don't want to be like, well, how do I keep the dust down, and how am I supposed to feed my kids, and how am I supposed to feed my family? And I'm mostly concerned for that and having more generations take on after me. So that's my concern, to get something figured out.
My name is Bruce Wilson. I have surface rights and I have a curtailed well. And I was thinking of some of the previous comments, and in terms of local control, wells, actually my water usage is determined by the consumptive use of my crops. If I have surface water rights, it seems to me that there might be times that that well would be beneficial to use instead of the surface water rights, and that might be applied within a ditch system because the consumptive use won't change as long as I have surface water rights, and maybe a local management tool could be some of these wells used in combination with the surface water rights.
I'm Charles Sylvester, president of the Godfrey Ditch Company. My concern today is we're not got all the facts based on some comments made. And to you, Mr. Frank, you mentioned not getting your fair share of surface water. I would like to know what fair share is. And so before we have the meeting in Gilchrist, give you time to establish what is fair share. Is it 100% of your water decrees, or 90, 80? I'll leave it to you to come up with that answer. And for you, Mr. Reagan Watson, since you have access to the CSU library and the archives on water, on the weirs measurement devices on the river, up and down the river from Denver to Sterling, wherever they are, the measurement for the past 150 years.
My name is Gene Camerzell. I farm at Milliken. I'm president of our ditch company, the Big Thompson and Platte River Ditch. We have two rights on that ditch. We have an 1865 right for 35 second feet and an 1875 right for 65 second feet. And the 14th of June, we fell to 9 feet. We were down to 9 feet until after the 4th of July. And again, with those older rights, there just simply wasn't water in the river. And I heard a few different people now discussing factors that influence the amount of water in the aquifer. And Reagan, I think this is very important to look at. Paving over, making the surface impermeable so you interrupt the deep percolation of the water. Changing in farming operations from going exclusively from furrow irrigation to center pivot. So you're not saturating that root zone. You're not causing deep percolation anymore. Phreatophytes. I heard an engineering study, I believe it was in 94 or 97, that they estimated at that time that over 400,000 acre feet per year, I think it was 450,000 acre feet per year, were being lost to phreatophyte consumptive use, and that they're projecting with the increase in the phreatophyte population and the size of those phreatophytes in the river, that number might now be closer to 1 million. I know for a fact that as the groundwater table gets pushed higher, it gets easier for those roots, those feeder roots, to get into that water and to consume more. So as the groundwater level is pushed higher through over-augmentation, those trees suck up more, and exponentially you're losing more water to phreatophyte consumption. So I think it's unfair to be pointing the finger at wells and saying, this is why we don't have enough water to get around. That there are a number of other factors that need to be included within the study to address those things that could be done to maybe minimize the losses there. I've heard people say, well, we ought to get D8s and go down into the Platte and push all the trees down. You don't need to do that. If we just draw the water table down below the reach of those roots, you're going to cut down on a significant loss of the water from the phreatophytes. Thank you.
Someone on this side?
Chuck Miller, a lifelong resident of the state of Colorado and very concerned. I haven't heard anything today about the three states agreement, so-called the Endangered Species Act. I believe in 1997, the state of Colorado gave a very large amount of water away for that purpose, 3 birds and a fish. Joe, you say we have a very big shortage of water, and I wonder how all this ties into the future.
So you want me to answer that question? Yeah, we have a shortage, and actually the 3 states program was negotiated. I mean, between Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, and the federal government. It actually allows for us to develop more water in Colorado, not from an agriculture standpoint. We can still utilize and capture all the water we need to irrigate the existing acres that were in 1997. Granted, we've actually lost acres since then from an agriculture standpoint, but from a municipal standpoint, there's replacements that are made that allow for municipal development of storage, the NISP project, other projects that are out there that are post 1997. So one of my huge concerns is that we not only are we seeing a shortage in agriculture water supply, but a municipal shortage that's out there for. I mean, we have just as big a gap out to the year 2050 because of a growing population. This allows us to develop some water and not dry up irrigated ground in the lower river, because that's exactly what would happen if we didn't have the program in place. I mean, it is a way to avoid buy and dry. So it really doesn't. It's not a new draw, I guess, or it doesn't have any impact on the wells that are up here that are curtailed. That is a water supply shortage that we have within the state, and a need for junior water rights to replace in time to senior water rights. And I guess since the question was asked of me on what does a full or a fair share of water mean, what are we entitled to downstream? I think every surface water right has a decree, just like every well has a decree, every augmentation plan has a decree, and so there's a number of acres that are irrigated under that decree. There's a flow rate, sometimes multiple flow rates, that they're not entitled to it, but they are allowed to use that when they're in priority. So if you have an 1875 water right for 200 cubic feet per second, and you're in priority, that's your fair share of water to take and to utilize and to put to beneficial use. And if a well were to intercept that water that's a 1943 well and multiply that over the entire basin, and those are junior to that water right, they are taking and intercepting that water because we know it drains back and eventually would hit the river. So the fair share is not necessarily even what a water right is for. It's what it's actually available to that in priority. What is available to the water right decree in priority. So multiple surface water users in this year were curtailed and cut short and didn't receive their full amount, but under the priority system received their fair share.
The governor, I'm Don Ament. Many of you might remember me. Good or bad, I guess. But in this case, I want to point out to everyone that I still represent Colorado with Wyoming, Nebraska, and the Department of Interior on the 3-state agreement. And I think everybody needs to understand the reason we're in a 3-state agreement is that we have no choice when EPA and the federal government has on the books an Endangered Species Act. That requires us, as water users that deplete the aquifer, to make sure that we account for our impacts on those endangered species down at Grand Island, and those are plovers, terns, and hoopers. And the fish that we talked about may or may not get involved in this. It's primarily the birds. Now, how are we doing this? We do this by taking water out at Tamarack in times of excess, primarily running pumps in the wintertime, and returning that water back to the river, not causing injury to anyone, returning that water back to the river to get to the habitat. Now, the thing this does for you, every single person in this room, beginning at the snow melt and going all the way to the state line, is to preclude you from going through a Section 7 consultation with an engineer and a lawyer and determining your impact on the species. And because of this overwhelming impact to all of us, the governors of the 3 states decided it might be smart if the state of Colorado, since really endangered species recovery is something that benefits, I guess, all society, that's how they voted anyway, that maybe all of society ought to help pay for this. So the Colorado legislature put in place a lot of money. It amounts to about $24 million to certify to the EPA and Fish and Wildlife Service that we, in fact, will, in good faith, take care of the impacts that we have at Grand Island. So this has been done now by buying up land. We have 10,000 acres now of critical habitat purchased at Grand Island. We are providing right now through retimed water about 10,000 acre feet. John Aldenhofen can probably tell you exactly how much water we're putting down there right now through retiming. And so when I hear criticism about what we're doing on the 3-state recovery program, you all just go home tonight and when you lay your head on your pillow, you decide whether you want to hire an expert engineer and a lawyer to work with Fish and Wildlife Service and EPA to determine exactly what your individual impact might be on Grand Island, and then decide whether we're doing a good job for you.
Thanks, Don. Aren't we lucky to have Donna Mint still working for us? That's okay. We can be stirred up a little. I'd like to point out that we have a sociologist in our group, Dr. Freeman, who actually has written a big, thick book about this subject. So you can read about all of that in his book. We have time for 4 or 5 more of you.
I'm Jim Yon. I'm the manager of the North Sterling Irrigation District in the Pruitt Reservoir. And I'm also the Interbasin Compact Committee representative for the South Platte Basin Roundtable. And a lot of you have heard me speak my piece before, but I'm going to make just a couple points, and then there are solutions that we can work out. So that's the thing that I would like to focus on the most. But I hear a lot that many are under the impression that there's just water flowing out of the state. And it happened in 2010 and 2011. And if we would have had storage buckets, we would have been able to store that and used it at the right time. That's one solution. Right now, 2012, there was a call on the river from April, the first week in April, clear till the end of October. There was no available water. We live in an arid climate and we have a water-short river. And so your fair share is whatever your decree says, like Joe said. We had farmers that were curtailed. They had to decide what they wanted to irrigate. We're no different than anybody else. They went and they did not irrigate their alfalfa the 3rd or 2nd time so that they could save water for their corn crop. They had to make those decisions this year, and we do that a lot because we're a water-short system, but all I want is my fair share, and that is according to my water right. There was a comment, Robert, and I appreciate your comment, because well users did spend a lot of money to start their wells and get them pumping and keep them pumping, but we do that on our surface water, and you know that. You're on a ditch system, you know that, the North Sterling Reservoir, when it was built, it was $2.4 million. It doesn't seem like very much, but it was a lot of money back in 1905. And there was people that went bankrupt because they They stuck their necks out. They tried to farm ground that never was farmed before, and they built up their system. And they've spent millions and millions of dollars since just trying to maintain that structure. And so those are my very few points, but really the solution is that I would rather see wells pump. I'd rather see Glenn Fritzler not have any water in his basement. And the way that you get the wells to pump is to make sure they have sufficient augmentation. Just like Joe said, you don't know when there's going to be a call on the river. You just don't know. And so how can we make that more efficient? And there are ways. Joe and I have been part of a group, the South Platte Water Co-op. Maybe some of you have heard of it, but we're trying. We're trying to make it more efficient. Inherent in recharge is inefficiency. Just like Joe said, you put the water in, you hope it comes back at the right time, but you have no control. You try to control it the best that you can, but you can't always control it. The way that you do it best is through conjunctively using surface storage as well. So you have a surface storage bucket, and our well users do it down in the Sterling area. They have the Pruitt Reservoir. They dump after their recharge isn't sufficient. So they dump the Pruitt Reservoir so that they can meet that need. And they're getting more and more efficient. But we can even become more efficient with a few other pieces of infrastructure along the river. You know, there is some water that goes out of the state, but there's drying points. Right now, the North Sterling is drying the river, or actually the North Sterling is passing a little bit to the Pruitt. The Pruitt is drying the river right now. We've been drying the river at the Pruitt or the North Sterling since September. There's no water that originates except downstream of us that goes out of the state. And that's the way the river works. But there is water that can be tapped into. Right now, we're actually in discussions with Central Colorado Water Conservancy District where maybe we can get tap into some of the free river conditions that are occurring from time to time down below the North Sterling, pump it up into the North Sterling ditch at a different location so that people upstream can tap into some of the water that's coming to our reservoir. That's the way you come up with these plans, and there's ways that we can do that, but we have to start talking about it together instead of just standing off at one another and saying, I want to pump my well, and I don't care about anybody downstream. That's the way we feel downstream. Maybe it's not the way you feel, but that's the way we feel downstream. Regardless of what you guys are downstream, we want to pump our well because we're more important. That's the way we feel. So just so you know, that's the whole feeling we get downstream. So, but there are solutions, and I'd like to start that, and I hope that some of this process would start that today.
I think that's a great place for us to end. I appreciate your point that it will require us all working together, and we did hear some potential solutions today, and Reagan was busily writing notes over here. As we said, there aren't going to be any easy answers, and when this study's done in 2013 on the last day, that doesn't mean we're going to have all the answers, but we appreciate your being a part of this process, and we want you to communicate with us either individually or through the website to give us more input from you. There's a gentleman here who has a comment to make. Yes, you may. And then we're going to break up because we need to get this room back in order for the roundtable meeting, and they're accustomed to meeting in square tables. So it's a round table. Why do you meet at square tables? Good question. Yes, sir.
My part of the 1278 study concern would be fracking water, because it doesn't matter where you go in Greeley, you back up, you can see all these tankers backed up to all the hydrants. You pump all that water down 7,000 feet, you got no return to the river. Thank you.
Okay, and then I'm going to turn the mic back over to Reagan and John for any closing comments here.
Okay, my comment would be that I think this is a great start. I really hear people listening, and even better yet, I hear people offering up some solutions. There's a saying in the West about, don't judge another man until you've walked a mile in his shoes. And so maybe we're starting that walk. Jim Lockhead told me one time, though, that the advantage is after a mile, you're a mile away from your adversary and you have his shoes.
Wow, I don't think I can top that. Thanks, John. Hey, Thanks, Robert. Thanks, Joe. Thanks to all of you all for coming out, for sharing your thoughts with us today. I take your comments very seriously. We're going to deliberate on all of them and try to make this a better study. Jim Yan, thanks for your last comment. I think you're right on. Let's see if we can work some solutions together as a basin. And in that vein, I'd like to thank the South Platte Roundtable for hosting this event and for working with us on 1278. We have 2 more of these meetings scheduled, Sterling on Monday, and then we're going to go to Gilchrist, I think, on the 24th. Again, the idea is just to try to reach out to the stakeholders, to the water users in the basin. Let's talk. Let's see what we can do. CWI will come back to you guys in March or April with data. Okay, so that's where we want to go from here. Begin to look at data and talk as a group. And with that, thank you all.